Ooh. In theory, it should start. Oh, yeah, there we go. Okay, I think we're live. Yes, we are.
Amazing.
So, it's lovely to have you, Mathilde. And
thank you.
Today we're going to discuss your research. So maybe you could start with a brief introduction.
Yeah, so I'm working at the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience, and I'm actually working in two departments. So the one department is that of Cognitive Neuroscience, and the other is Clinical Psychological Science. And exactly, if you combine those two, it really covers the whole aspect of my PhD, which is about transgender people. So people whose gender assigned at birth is incongruent with their gender identity. And we're looking at both neurobiological factors, but we're also investigating sexual well-being in this population.
Okay, and maybe if you explain how you're going to go about doing this in your research, that would be beneficial for those at home.
Well, basically speaking, it's very hard to just pinpoint one thing that we do because we use multiple methods. So instead of just sticking to one kind of investigation, we do several things, and we hope to get a more holistic vision of what's going on in transgender people. For instance, the most important one, but that's actually currently on hold due to the corona crisis, is a longitudinal neuroimaging study. When I say longitudinal, I mean that we would test the same people at different time points to kind of see how their brain evolves and how this is connected to their well-being, to their self-concept, to other psychological factors. And other studies that we're doing are completely different. For instance, we have a very interesting so-called diary study running. And when I say diary study, I don't mean that people have to share their diary pages with us. What I mean is that we run the study on smartphones, so people just have to install an app on their smartphone. And then every day we will send them the same questionnaires, very short questionnaires on their smartphone in this app. And then they just have to answer it. And if they do this for a very long time, we do it 3 weeks, then you can get a beautiful picture of how different variables move together and which variables influence the other ones, and so on and so on. And for this study, we mainly focus on sexual well-being, but we're also designing more simple questionnaire studies that will just run online. We have a very interesting study running or more on psychophysiological measures in transgender women under sexual arousal. So we actually are doing all kinds of things, and then we hope not to just focus on one aspect of what it is like to be transgender and to transition, but to get a more holistic image of what these people need.
That's very interesting. And two things in what you just said really stand out. So if I ask them both together, maybe then you can respond in part. So you said that one, the imaging has been placed on hold because of the crisis. So how will that be substituted, or will you just delay until you can wait? And a lot of this is looking for a holistic picture. What do you perceive that picture to be going into it? Do you have any idea as of yet?
Yeah. So the first question, what if we cannot do our neuroimaging study? Will we just postpone it? Will we substitute it? And there's two things that we kind of have to take into account. One thing is, of course, like theoretical relevance. Can we find something that means the same thing, that has the same clinical relevance, the same scientific relevance as a neuroimaging study? But the second thing that we have to take into account, unfortunately, is, of course, practical matters. So I'm running on a fixed contract, like in 2 years, a bit over 2 years, my term will end. I'm also running on a budget, and as long as I'm working on the project, this budget just runs out. So we also, even if I would dream of just postponing it as long as it can, practically speaking, that's not how it works, even though you would want that in an ideal world. So we'll have to act quick, basically. And there's several options at this point. Like I said, we plan to do a longitudinal study and test people at different time points. But there's the chance that this won't happen and that it will be a so-called cross-sectional study in which you only have one time point and you just compare all the people in this time point as in contrast to comparing them to themselves at different time points. And you can not make the same conclusions, you can't see the same things. It's some kind of limitation, but it's not meaningless at all, especially because we're designing new functional neuroimaging tasks, which will definitely give us new information of what's going on. This will already be meaningful on a cross-sectional level. And another thing to mention there is that, and I might be kind of kicking against my own shins here in the sense that I'm saying that neuroimaging and brain research is not determinate. Like it's in itself, it's not that meaningful in this specific population. What I mean is, for instance, if we look for differences in brains of transgender people and cisgender people, so people who aren't transgender, if we find a difference on the brain level, but it doesn't translate to anything behavioral or to any feelings, then this difference is meaningless. So you will always want to link your neuroimaging research to behavioral correlates or responses on a survey or something like that, because in itself it's not meaningful, I think. So it's also not too dramatic if it doesn't happen. Then we are of course interested in how transgender people feel and how they evolve, and we can also just ask them. Yeah, and then I forgot your second question.
That was a lot, to be honest. However, the second question was more, what are your current hypotheses, if there are any, and how do you see this holistic picture coming together?
Well, basically, when we talk about transgender people and when we talk about gender in general, we're always taking a very binary approach. We're thinking of males and females. But in practice, we see that there's also a lot of people who identify something in between or something outside of it, or who are fluid in their gender identity. So it's pretty clear from practice that we can't hold on to this much longer. However, when you look at transgender literature, and especially the neuroimaging literature, we see that authors really hold on to this gender binary, in the sense that the question that is most often asked in this research line is whether, for instance, transgender women, whether they have a male brain or a female brain. And also with other questionnaires, we always tend to take this very binary approach. But I don't think that's something that we can continue if we want to explain the experience, if we want to understand the experience of all transgender people, also including those that are non-binary. So we're kind of trying to shift or complement the narrative with another one, where we focus more on the so-called self-concept. So self-concept is a psychological term. It's a construct that basically entails all the ideas, all the feelings that you have about yourself. And within this self-concept, we have different aspects. So for instance, you have an actual self-concept, you have an ideal self-concept. And it actually speaks for itself what it is. So your actual self-concept, those are all the ideas you have about yourself as who you currently are. And then your ideal self-concept is who you would ideally want to be. So the person you want to be, you want to become. And there's already a lot of research on these self-concepts and the discrepancies between them in other populations, but it hasn't been applied yet to transgender people. And we at Maastricht University think that it's actually a very heuristic concept, that it's beautiful to apply this to transgender people, no matter where they fall on this spectrum of gender. Like also for non-binary people, you could say that at some point they might want to transition or have certain elements of a gender transition, like certain elements of the hormone therapy, but not necessarily shift all the way to the other side of the spectrum. And then you can't talk in this binary way, but you can still question their ideal self-concept and compare it to their actual self-concept. So both in our sexual studies as well in our neuroimaging study, we're actually focusing on this idea of at some point in their lives, transgender people realize, aha, my actual and ideal self-concept are far away from each other, and they would be happier if we could shift it to a bit more together. So this is kind of the framework that we're working in.
That's very interesting. Why do you feel that there hasn't been more research into this self-concept and the actual self-concept within transgender viewpoint? Because surely that would be one area where you see the greatest divergence between the actual self-concept and the ideal self-concept.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very good question. I think one of the reasons there hasn't really been research into this yet is because transgender research in itself is actually still very, very young. It's also still very niche, a very small research area. And I think it's pretty easy to understand why that is. For instance, a couple of years ago, it was still more taboo than today. Today we're better, but I still don't think we're there yet because, for instance, if I were living in Hungary today, I wouldn't be able to do this research because there they assume that transgender isn't a thing, that it doesn't exist. This is, of course, very explicit and very extreme, but this tendency is also still there, I guess, on a more implicit level. And what I mean by that is that it's not so easy to get grants on transgender research, that not everyone is in favor of this research happening, either because, they have certain prejudice against the group, or because they think, okay, fine, whatever, people can be transgender, but I don't see why we have to do research on this. So that's one of the reasons that in transgender research in general, as a whole, is still a very small thing. So you can expect them to be this little thing in it to also be very small. But then why haven't people who are doing this kind of research been looking into it? Well, I think also because the research is still very young. I think it makes sense that they have started from this more male-female binary idea and try to explain the phenomenon within this framework. For the times where these things started, I think I can completely understand that this is where researchers come from and that we still have that legacy. And I'm also not throwing it away altogether, but I'm saying that we need to complement it with a more holistic view, a more fluid view, maybe even. So I think it's really just too early, and we're still figuring out how to look at transgender people as researchers. And this happens to be our idea, and we are going to give this a try. And we might be entirely off, and then we know, and then we'll find some other way to explain it and to frame it.
That's very interesting. Thank you. At this point, I will just give a second to inform our very engaged audience that if they want to ask questions, I can see their comments, so they are more than welcome to jump in and seize your knowledge, should they want to. If not,
Definitely.
It's just me, and I'll get to pleasure from this very interesting conversation. So you said it's quite a young field. Do you think we'll see, therefore, a lot of developments in the coming decade or so in comparison to other areas of psychology?
Yeah, I can't really compare to other areas of psychology as I'm not in them, so I don't know how fast everything else is going. But yeah, definitely, I'm quite sure. Over the last 10 years or so, the conversation on this topic, at least in Western Europe, has changed so drastically that it is becoming more and more normal and more on the research agenda, which is a really good thing. And you also see, like, especially, I'm most at home in the literature on neuroimaging in this population, and it's really skyrocketing. It's booming every year. There's more publications, which I think is a really good thing. And also, yeah, it's a topic. When you do research in it, it engages you. You can't help but feel very involved. And when things in the news, like the news from Hungary, where they kind of make transgender people out of existence, you can't help but be touched by this. And I think a lot of people who are doing research in this field, I noticed also the people from EPAS, which is like European Professional Association for Transgender Health. they're so driven to get good research out there, and the conferences are already of super high quality. I am very confident that that we will learn a lot coming 10 years, and I hope I can contribute towards.
So obviously that is very interesting, and it's good to hear that a large production is and a growing production of research is happening. You say that you want to contribute. Where do you see yourself going after this study?
Yeah, it's a very good idea. It's also a personal question in a way. Yeah, ideally, I would just, depending on what comes out of my studies, of course, I would like to extend this line. Of course, I think there's still a lot of gaps in the research. Also, like I said, we also do research into sexual well-being of these people, and so far, while I think it's a very logical thing to investigate, because you're messing with sex hormones, you're undergoing gender affirmative surgery. Of course, this translates between the sheets, right? It's the most logical thing to think of, maybe. But so far, the questions that have been asked, yeah, have been very medical and dry almost. There's not a lot of research into subjective experience when it comes to sexuality. So mainly the questions are very functional, like, is everything working? And I think we should go past that, because that's not what sexual well-being is about, not only this. So I would love to contribute to this and to see it growing, and there's still so much to do. Also, when it comes to neuroimaging, like there's still so much that we need to find out. We don't have all the pieces of the puzzle yet, not at all. So I hope I get a chance to do it, but we'll see. It's not easy.
That is all very, very interesting. And I need a new question. So you said that you feel the literature almost, while there's a lot being built up, is quite incomplete. Do you think there's a reasonable chance that it would almost match that of cisgendered people in sexual well-being within your lifetime? Or do you think that a lot more effort needs to be put in to match it?
I don't think it will catch up with the cisgender literature, which maybe also makes sense, because there's also, how do I say it? Yeah, there's other things to investigate when it comes to sexual well-being that have nothing to do with being transgender or cisgender. Like, there's a lot of sexual dysfunctions, and that's an own area of literature, and that's already so big. I don't see transgender literature catching up with that. But there's definitely a lot of room, and I think at some point, like, at first you of course want to investigate the differences. Like, you want to know what is it specifically that we need to take into account when we want to guide a transgender person in sex therapy or in something like that. Then you kind of need to know what the specifics are and where the differences lie. But in the end, we should also evolve and just see where there's things that are alike, and where it doesn't matter what your gender identity is, or whether you have gender dysphoria. And in that case, I think we should kind of aim for an overlap and include transgender participants in research on sexuality that isn't specifically focused on transgender individuals. And I think the same thing, to be honest, about neuroimaging research. At the beginning, you kind of want to zoom in and see, okay, are there areas in the brain that kind of explain gender dysphoria, or that can help us understand how we can help transgender people feel better about themselves. But once you're there, you will also probably have a lot of brain areas, brain functions that are not affected by being transgender or cisgender. And in that case, I say we have to go in other fields of neuroimaging to a more inclusive approach, and don't exclude participants because they're transgender. I don't know if this is happening a lot right now, but I know that it's a bit of a difficult issue, because also in neuroimaging research, like, there's still this debate whether there's a male or female brain, and a lot of neuroscientists include gender as a covariate in their analysis, or they use it as a variable in their analysis. And it's difficult to know what to do with someone whose sex assigned at birth is different from their gender identity and their gender expression. And then it becomes tempting to say, okay, we just exclude those people. But I think we should, in all areas of research, evolve towards an approach where we know that there's actually no consistent difference and that we can just include them.
Building on that almost, do you feel that while certain quantities of research do exclude the assessment of trans people in imaging, that actually it will just continue to hold back the field because there won't be that building in other areas where there is within cisgender, and that continued focus on cisgendered and exclusion of transgender will feed back into the inability to get funding in a large number of areas and other problems within research at the moment, or not?
Yeah. I can. Yeah, it's difficult to say because, like I said, there's only so little that has been done right now when it comes to neuroimaging and transgender people. So I also can't really predict how much of a difference there is between them and cisgender people, and whether it's okay to just include them when you're, for instance, investigating the visual cortex. Then I don't see why it would be different in a transgender person than from a cisgender. But yeah, so what was your question again?
Do you think that by currently excluding them from neuroimaging studies where you have gender as a covariant, that it's actually holding back further research into transgender imaging as itself?
This I don't think is the case. I think the fact that it was hard to start this research line up is rooted in very different issues that we just discussed. Yeah.
Okay. No one at home has any questions. That's a bit disappointing. I expected better of them.
They can email me afterwards.
Okay, well, we're coming into the final 5 minutes, so if they do have questions, they should get them in now. Maybe you want to now speak with some almost concluding remarks in mind about what the most important things you would see as the takeaway from your research at the moment.
Yeah, I don't have much takeaway from my research because most of it is on hold, right? I'm only a PhD student. I'm really a junior in this field. So I don't have any results that I can share right now. So of course I can't give a takeaway for that. But as a more general takeaway, I think when it comes to transgender research, what both people who read about the research and people who want to participate, but of course the researchers themselves as well, should really realize is that we're not doing research on gravitational forces or on atoms or on a virus, or we're doing research on people. And you can't get essentialist with that. You can't assume that, especially with the methods that we have right now, with neuroimaging, we always expect, like, okay, it's the holy grail of psychology research. We can finally look into the brain and fully understand people. But right now we're not there yet, and especially not when it comes to super complex phenomena such as gender identity, right? It's not just vision, or which is also already super complicated, but this is another layer to it. And when I say that we're not doing research on gravitational forces, that actually has meaning, because gravity doesn't care what you think about it. And I can have all kinds of stupid ideas about gravity as a researcher. If I do my proper research, I will only see the truth. Like, there's an essence to this. But it's very different with doing research with transgender people, because the ideas that we have as researchers, our own opinions about it, they do have an influence on the object that you're investigating, to say like that. And this is something to keep in mind, because you might get tempted, and especially when you have a fMRI scanner at your disposal, to see it as if you this bias or your own ideas don't play a role anymore, because you have this big machine that's doing the work for you. But it isn't. You're still talking about people. You still have to be very careful. with how you analyze things, with how you design your studies. And it would be a shame if people get arrogant with this and claim that they have the truth, and don't disclose their own opinions about this topic. And you can prevent yourself from letting your bias slip in, but you have to do everything you can, and you have to realize that the theories that you have, the research findings you might have, that they might just affect the people that you're talking about. And I feel like within the field of transgender research, and especially the neuroimaging one, I would like this conversation to be out there a bit more. Like, okay, what are we doing, and what kind of questions are we asking, and what does it mean if we find a certain thing, and what does it mean if we don't find it, and that we keep this in mind, that whatever we do, even if we give it like this big, almost beta science touch to it by doing neuroimaging research, it's still about people and not just about a brain in a vat. I really don't think so. So
that is a very
takeaway that we should keep in mind that we're not doing this research in isolation.
That is very valuable. However, we have an audience question.
That's amazing.
So Sophie asks, could you elaborate more on the problems that exist with neuroimaging and how it is being used to prove that there are male and female brains?
I would love to do so. Actually, it's a super interesting topic, this whole idea of male and female brains, because I already mentioned the word like essentialism. It assumes that there is like a typical female brain and a typical male brain. However, and here I recommend Sophie to read research from Professor Daphne Joel from Tel Aviv University, whom is doing research on what they call the brain mosaic. And basically her thesis is that there is no such thing as a typical male or female brain. There are only a couple of features that can be more feminine or more masculine, but actually everyone has a mosaic of these features. So if you want to do it very cliche, then you divide your brain in, 200 areas. In every area, you color it either blue, or you color it pink, or you let it white, if you kind of fall in between. And then both your lovely host Alastair and myself, our brains would just look like a patchwork of pink and blue. And for the majority of people, this is the case. And this makes it actually very, very difficult, because if you look at singular features, you could say, okay, women typically have smaller amygdalas and men have typically larger amygdalas. Sure, but for almost every part of the brain, you might find a singular difference at a group level. But if you look at an individual level, it becomes very hard to predict what their brain could look like, because it can be a mosaic of all these things. And of course, if there is no such thing as a male or a female brain in the beginning, then of course you cannot translate it to transgender research. Yeah. Hope that answers her question.
Yes, I think that the stream may be slightly behind where we are. So maybe if we give her a little bit to respond, and then we'll see. But otherwise, okay, now I'm definitely speaking. That's good. That was interesting, though. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I there's a super interesting talk on Vimeo from Professor Sophie Scott from UCL. Maybe this is Sophie asking this question, who knows? But I will share it with you in private, and then you can put it in the description. And I think for people who want to find out more about how we look at male and female brains, and what are the problems there, I think it's definitely a very interesting talk.
So Sophie says, thank you for your answer. And I think on that note, I will thank you as well very much for giving us half an hour of your time.
Don't worry, my pleasure.
And it was lovely speaking to you. And now, if I just go here and click that,